My name is Sam McGeown. I'm a senior consultant working for Extrovert. My colleagues here are...
I'm Jonathan Med, also a senior consultant at Extrovert.
I'm Michael Poore. Used to be a senior consultant at Extrovert, so I now work for VMware.
We still let him talk, just about. So, thanks for coming. We're going to talk to you about cloud automation, how you find the silver lining. I said my name was Sam McGowan. So let's jump in straight away. So first question, we were nicely introduced by Joe this morning. The question that we were going to ask is why bother with automation? I think possibly he answered that a lot better than me. But some of the thoughts that we had was around standardization. You know, if you're automating a process, deploying stuff by a standard process, well then if it's a standard, you can automate it. You reduce the amount of human errors, and you can save time. You can be a hero. You can do a lot more with less. My favorite automation was always replacing two highly paid contractors who were literally just building servers with a PowerShell script. They thanked me later. You can do more fun stuff, not only with automation, but you don't spend your time on all of the dull stuff. So you can do more fun stuff, get rid of the boring, repetitive jobs. And as Joe pointed out, you can save your job. If you're doing manual infrastructure processes, it's likely, as Joe says, not me, I didn't say that. Joe says you're not likely to have a job in a few years if you're just manually repeating stuff, certainly not in 5 or 10 years. So the question is, can you afford not to move up the stack, not to move higher up the abstraction away from your old infrastructure sort of roles? So that's enough about that question. Let's move on to some war stories. Michael.
Thank you. Yeah, so one of the things we thought about when we were putting this presentation together, when we were discussing the topics, is we wanted to cover some of the war stories, some of the projects that we've all worked on, some of them together, that we've done over the last few months around the cloud automation sort of area, if you like. So the one I'm going to talk about is a project, quite a big project, that I've actually recently come off. It took about 11 months, basically. So it's a multi-tenant private cloud project, automation using VRA, or actually VCAC technically, because it's that older version, and involves quite a lot of automation of networking and a lot of day 2 operations, things like that. So the project itself, as I mentioned, based on VCAC, also included NSX, built on vSphere, lots of VCO. I know I wrote a recent blog post about not saying VCO anymore. I wrote this slide first, though. And there were basically 47 service requests, all focused around creating virtual machines, managing them, creating logical networks, and managing all sorts of security around those. In a minute, I'll focus on some of the, or one of the examples from the creating logical networking. Pretty diagram, don't even try and read it, but actually, why do we even need to bother? Why is the infrastructure really important? At the end of the day, it's a bunch of servers that's set up to do something, and that something is provide an automation platform. So I'm not going to bother to talk about most of that. The only real important things are the fact that it's VRA, it's provisioning to vCenter. One of the interesting things in there was a whole bunch of integrations with various REST hosts. So things like the NSX managers. Each of the 5 data centers had a manager. I've only shown 2 there. An integration with Infoblox, IPAM, using REST. Also a customer custom REST interface that we also had to work with. A couple of SOAP interfaces as well. Sorry, you might see a few movie references in here from time to time. A couple of SOAP interfaces that we had to work with. One focused around billing, another focused around workload monitoring. And the dreaded CDK. Don't know if anyone knows about this. Anyone used the CDK in VCAC before? No, right, well, you're lucky. VCAC, VRA provides a standard number of, if you like, breakout points or workflow stubs where you can actually make changes or intercept the workflow VM provisioning. When you have to use a CDK, it's normally because the point at which you want to break into the product is not publicly available. You have to buy a license. It's pretty awkward. There's not a lot of documentation around it. Yeah, we had to do it, unfortunately. It wasn't particularly pleasant, but there we go. Very quick one on the logical network infrastructure from a tenant perspective. It was quite complicated. Got all the virtual machines connected into an NSX DLR, several edge service gateways. We had to provide automation that configured all of these automatically. So I mentioned talking about the logical networking. So creating the logical network was one of the catalog items we provided for this customer. So it's literally just a request in there, brings up a form where they can select their data center they want to create their network in, provide some basic details. Ignore the VPN stuff for now, I'll come back to that much later. And submit it, and then just goes through a little process where it gets some configuration items, gets information about the person who's requested it, then gets some details about the DLR, creates a virtual wire in NSX. We do that using the API guide, so it's all REST and XML, sending emails out to the customer with formatted information in, returning the virtual wire so it can be added as an item in VRA. Sorry, I'm spinning through this very quickly, but they've got to go in a minute. So you can see the item actually gets returned within the portal. Actually adding the interface to the DLR that we showed earlier so that you can actually route things, creating the network within IPAM so that we can manage the addresses, and finally updating the data dictionary so that you can provision new VMs against it. It's quite a complex process. Workflow looks a bit like that. It's very ugly, but it does work. A default error handler would have been nice in VCO, sorry. And there's lots of moving parts, lots of places where it can go wrong. And we had lots of in-project changes, the VPN for one. But anyway, over to Jonathan.
Thank you. Okay, so similar kind of project to Michael's, might actually have been the same one. Did a fair bit of work around virtual machine deployment and provisioning, which is typically what a lot of people want to use these systems for. What you may not know is within VRA, there's a couple of different approaches you can take, and there are some quite significant benefits and challenges depending on which route you go down. I've actually now worked on a couple of different of these projects. They use two different methods, and there's been some quite tough choices to make depending on which route you go down. So, quick summary of the two. If you're approaching one of these projects and you're looking at doing the multi-machine deployment and you're still using VRA 6, you need to consider whether you're going to use the inbuilt blueprints within VRA or whether you want to go and do everything yourself in VRO. And there's some quite pros and cons of each one. So if you go with the inbuilt blueprints, the main pro is that pretty much everything's done for you. So you think, nice and easy, let's just go with what we've actually paid for, quite straightforward. What I've found and what the customers tend to want is that the actual form, that when they come to use it, even though all the stuff you do behind the scenes works great, they come and use this system and the form design is quite lacking. So just an example, this CPU memory storage graphic on the screen is typically what you would present to the consumer of that, and they've got little clicky buttons that can change how many CPUs do you want, how much storage, But that isn't necessarily what the customer wants to present to the users. For instance, on one of the projects, they wanted to offer t-shirt size VMs, so small, medium, large, extra large. Pretty difficult to do that out of the box. And so you need to find these sorts of things out before you've gone 4 months into the project and gone down that particular route and find that you've done all this work and they don't really like what you've given them, even though it does actually do, at the end point, what they asked for. So quite a key thing is at an early stage to go in and maybe show them this is what it would look like if you went down this route. The alternative is you use the advanced service designer, which effectively means you're going to do everything in VRO. The good point about that is you can customize the form pretty much more extensively. You can do, if you're familiar with VRO and the presentation field of workflows, anything that you do in there you can bring in. So you can do drop-downs that you can populate with information from external systems. You can do some quite fancy stuff. A drawback of that is once you tell a customer, oh yeah, you can do this, 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 and this, they actually want you to go and do that. And the scope of the project can suddenly become, the form design is bigger than the actual work that you actually have to do behind the scenes. The other drawback is you then have to go and do a lot of the provisioning steps that VRA standard blueprints would do for you. So extra development time. Once you've done it once, it's okay, but you've got to go and do all that hard work yourself. So the key thing really is to identify with the customer which of these routes do they want to go down right at the beginning and get them to stick to it, which isn't always particularly easy. So Sam, I think you've got a story for us.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you about yet another service provider. I've just been thinking while we've been talking, all three of us have talked about service providers. Don't take too much into that. It's just typically service providers are earlier on or further along in the adoption and the automation that they do. So the stories we've got are all about the more advanced automation. But now these projects are probably 6 months ago to a year ago for us. Now we're in enterprises and we're in sort of SMBs and that sort of thing as well, doing similar sorts of things. So don't take too much away from we're all talking about service providers. It's just those were the examples that we had. So I'm going to talk about, I was working for a service provider, quite a well-known name, and I was automating their onboarding system for their public cloud. So their previous process was sort of a 150-page paper document carried out by their in-house automation monkey, basically someone working through this document and doing all the steps manually. And they asked me to come along and use some orchestrator. I was orchestrating vCloud Director, also calling out to things like UCS Manager, integrating with ServiceNow and several different sort of SOAP APIs and that sort of thing. It was an interesting company to work for. I had a project manager in India on Indian Standard Time, so I didn't get to talk to him till after lunchtime when it was more or less useless. ServiceNow, they had custom development company for ServiceNow who were in Spain. They were lovely people, really nice, friendly people who had a siesta in the middle of the day and knocked off at about 4 o'clock. So they were less than easy to contact. We had a platform support team, so the people managing the infrastructure that I was developing for, they were in Bulgaria. There was quite a interesting process around that. It took 7-day SLAs to get things changed. So when I said, "Oh, can I please do this on the UCS Manager?" They said, "Sure, we'll get that done for you in 7 days." So it was interesting from that point of view, and I've put in double quotes an architecture team in the UK. The architect who wrote the document that I was working for had actually left the company the day before I arrived, and it was the new guy's first day on the job when I arrived. So there was obviously, he was learning the system, I was learning the system. There was a lot of communication problems, but that's typical when you're working with larger companies, that there will be soft challenges as well as the technical ones. So I thought I actually wanted to highlight that, because although the automation, we're interfacing different languages, different systems, actually we're also interfacing between an Indian team and a Spanish team and a Bulgarian team and a UK team. So I thought that was quite an important thing to think about as well, is you've actually got to communicate with the people involved, because it's applications that you're doing. Automating public cloud. The initial request I had, it was 4 workflows. I thought, this is easy. 4 workflows. Create a VDC, update a VDC, create a VORG, and update a VORG. So simple. It escalated quickly. Going through the document, we found out, actually, now we just need to integrate with ServiceNow, but actually it's not standard ServiceNow CMDB. We've written our own custom interface, SOAP interface with it. You're going to have to integrate with this custom interface. So things like it didn't quite interpret SOAP messages according to the standards, so you had to take the output from Orchestrator, which was a standard SOAP output, according to the W3C standards and all that, which it didn't understand. It spat out its dummy whenever you sent that to it, because they hadn't adhered to standards. UCS Manager, that was another interesting one. At the time, VMware had written a UCS plugin, but also Cisco were betaing a UCS plugin. They had different version numbers. I don't know if you guys probably hit that problem, where they didn't work. They're very complicated plugins to work with, basically a nightmare. And also there were things like a custom SOAP interface that would actually go off to RIPE and register companies against IP addresses, so proper ISP stuff. And it was just this interface, SOAP interface, that I could fire up against, which had no authentication against it. So I did toy for a little while with just sort of registering a huge number of IP addresses against my name, and then I thought I'd probably get fired, so I didn't. But you just casually toss in some so the initial project was, I think it was 10 days, extended to 15 days, and then I spent 3 months in total doing this. They casually tossed in the fact that with error handling, they didn't just want to handle the error. If there was an error, they wanted to roll back and unpick every single thing that they did. So your create a VDC actually has to involve delete a VDC as well. If you want to create a VORG or update a VORG, you've also got to be able to roll it back. So there was a lot more than the 4 workflows. So what happened is we started off with some nice, simple workflows. There's not a lot really going on there. And ended up with 123 workflows to support these 4 basic requests. And that then, right, this is, be ready for wow, this is my PowerPoint animation skills going on right here. Here it comes. This is my favorite workflow ever now. It's enormous. You have to actually tune the orchestrator client. You have to tune its memory consumption in order to be able to open it properly, because it will kill your client. It's that big. What I take away from that war story is it's the soft stuff that counts. Technically you can probably do everything, but make sure you get your requirements early and all that sort of thing. Pretty much the same stories that we've all put together. So how'd you get started?
Okay, so I'm just going to skip through a few things here about how to get started with automation. If you're sitting there thinking this is something I'm interested in, I'm not quite sure where to start, hopefully can give you a few ideas. So particularly if we're talking about VMware automation, which if you're at the VMUG, hopefully that's one of the things you're interested in. So there's a number of different choices where you might get started. Do I look at something like Power CLI? Do I look at Orchestrator? If I'm going to look at Orchestrator, should I start out with some of the built-in workflows? Drag and drop, maybe I'm more comfortable with that kind of thing. Or do I need to go and learn some JavaScript before starting with Orchestrator? Because Orchestrator uses a JavaScript engine for some of the things you need to do. So Power CLI, PowerShell, I think can be quite a good starting point if you're coming from an infrastructure background, as I did, with absolutely no programming experience whatsoever ever before. Is a language which I found personally relatively straightforward to pick up, and the amount of time I needed to put into learning it quickly paid off. At the time, there weren't a lot of resources for learning, a few books, but a number of years on, there's now an absolute wealth of resources for learning these things. There's books, online video training like Pluralsight, classroom training. If you search for a problem, you pretty much find that you'll end up on someone's blog who's already solved the problem. You're not typically having to find out a lot of these things yourself. Microsoft and VMware have developed these tools so they're easy for administrators to pick up. And if you've used it at all before, typically you're getting these pre-packaged commandlets that you run which do what you think they would, like get VM, that kind of thing. You can tell almost by looking at it what it's going to do for you. So I would suggest that can be quite a good starting point. It also gives you a very good grounding when you need or want to go on and start learning maybe other languages or just the principles of automating things. If you're familiar with doing stuff in vCenter with an automation tool, when you move to use another tool, some of those concepts are pretty similar, and it gets a lot easier to switch in between the different tools. And,
Jonathan's
yes.
being modest here. If you've got a problem with PowerShell, you probably end up on his blog.
Yeah, I was going to say that, jonathanmed.net.
Thank you. You've put me off now. The other reason I would suggest is a good idea is that the amount of time you put into it will also pay off if you work with any of these other products. So not just the Microsoft set like Windows, Exchange, but pretty much everyone is bringing out a PowerShell toolkit these days to support their products. So VMware obviously has one, Power CLI, but Citrix, if you use Zen Desktop, Veeam, Amazon, Cisco UCS, that they all ship these toolkits, and that is in part because that's what customers are asking them for. And you've got storage companies. We've got a gentleman over there, SolidFire, they've recently produced PowerShell toolkit, and this is, I think it's fair to say, because the customers are asking them for this. The benefit is you learn the fundamentals of PowerShell, you can quickly go and pick up someone else's toolkit for that product. You haven't got to go and learn a completely different command line interface for automating that product. So I think that's quite a good place to start. If you want to start with Orchestrator, you can use it in standalone mode. So you don't have to get into a whole big VRA, VRO custom development project to start off with if you don't want to. Orchestrator comes as part of your vCenter deployment if you want it to be. And you can automate tasks within vCenter and external systems. No extra purchase needed. If you do end up on a VRA project, you can do a lot of stuff out of the box, but typically you're going to be integrating with a customer's system. As the other guys have mentioned, like deploying a VM or deploying a network or deploying VCD doesn't necessarily just mean deploying that actual thing. When you actually go and talk to the customer and find out what that actually means, it typically is the tip of the iceberg is the headline item of deploy an org in VCD, and then there are 20 other systems that you need to go and update or change or notify someone that that thing has actually happened. So within VRA, that pretty much means you're going to need to know how to use VRO because of their integration and the extensibility it gives you. I found, I picked up VRO about 18 months ago. There's a growing but currently still limited set of resources for learning it. So there are a few books now on the latest versions. There's a few blogs and things, but pretty much if I get stuck on a problem, you tend to end up on the VMware communities page, which is a good thing. There's quite a lot of helpful people there, and hopefully they've already solved your problem. Or you can post your questions there. It is growing as the adoption of these tools become more prevalent, but you may find it a little harder to get started with, maybe compared to PowerShell, just because there aren't that many resources there as well. Also, there is stuff out of the box which comes in the form of plugins. So, a bit like the previous slide, there are integration tools as part of the product for working with non-VMware systems. So things like InfoBlocks, Cisco UCS, some Microsoft things like Active Directory, and also the VMware one's NSX. Which brings me on to one thing that is worth considering, and that I hear a lot is, oh, there's a plugin for it, so we know we're going to be okay. So you're on a project, we need to integrate with XYZ system, there's a plugin for it, all is good. What you actually need to find out before you commit and say, yes, that means we can absolutely do in there what we need to do, is that the plugin doesn't necessarily cover every single part of the product. So you could hit some issues there. If it's a third-party one, or dare I even say a VMware one, it might not actually be very good. And you end up having to do some custom work again. As I think we've already alluded to, the infamous Cisco UCS plugin, which initially was created by Cisco or possibly by VMware. Then Cisco created one and was supported with different versions of different products and was just a massive support headache. So basically, do your research in advance. Don't commit to anything until you're absolutely sure you know you can do what the project needs you to do with the plugin. JavaScript. So I've heard quite a few comments that say, oh, you don't need to learn any JavaScript for working with VRO. You can use all the inbuilt workflows. You can use plugins. We don't want to basically put you off from using the tool because you think you've got to go and learn yet another development language. And while that is true to a certain extent, they are really actually lying, because you're really not going to get that far with it unless you can do some of the basics. Now, I'm not saying you've got to go out and become some bearded Java developer or JavaScript developer with years and years of experience, but you will need to pick up some very straightforward programming concepts, which if you took my advice and already spent some time learning PowerShell, you will quickly pick up, because the concepts are the same. It's just typically syntax is different, slightly different approaches. So things like if statements, for loops, changing variables. So one part of a workflow, you maybe need to change some text between one and another. Just being able to pick that up, change the text, pass it on to the next step, things like that. Or quite commonly picking out properties from an object. So previously, when I've done some PowerShell training, the concept of object-orientated programming can be quite difficult for infrastructure guys to pick up, but once you crack that, it is particularly important. And so it sounds more complex than it actually is. What it really means is take one step in a workflow and say, I've got a virtual machine, but I've now got to do something else and I need the name of that virtual machine. Being able to go and pick that name property from the VM and pass it to the next step in the workflow can be a little difficult to get your head around, but once you figure that out, it's quite a straightforward step. So things like that is the kind of level you need to get to initially to be able to do some more stuff than just what you get out of the box. If you want to go on and learn a whole lot more and get a lot better at it, but don't be put off by the fact that you will need to learn some, but don't fall into the trap that you can get away without anything. Plenty of tools for learning JavaScript. It's been around a long time, similar kind of things. So Pluralsight, there's a ton of courses on there. Or you've probably got traditional classroom training. Code Academy was one I found good. So it was a free online training course for JavaScript. I spent about a day going through that to prepare for a VRO project I'd been dropped into. Okay, and then a couple of other things that you probably also need to think about and start getting used to. So it isn't necessarily just learning the languages and what tools you need to use, but pretty much every company has some kind of custom systems that are not going to have these plugins or these PowerShell toolkits already provided for you. It might have been developed in-house. It may be some ancient system that is no longer being updated, but the whole company is running off of it, and you've got to integrate with it. So all of these tools will typically work with these kind of data types or endpoints. So it's worth spending some time in advance just getting used to how these sort of things work. So things like SQL databases, as an administrator, you've probably set up SQL at some point and created a database. What I'm talking about is just taking that one little step further and maybe running some SQL code to create an entry in a table or update an entry in a table. That's something I had to learn, and there's a wealth of resources out there, but you spend a bit of time in advance doing that sort of thing and working out how in PowerShell or VRO you would make those requests will pay off. And similarly with things like XML or JSON or REST, these types of systems are really common that you need to integrate with as part of these automation type projects. And if you know how to work with them in a standard way in advance of that, when you come to a new system, it's like, okay, we've got this REST system. It's like, okay, fine, I know how to deal with that. I know how to run some basic requests against it and get some information out or get it to do something. So get familiar with those in advance. If you want to look for some examples, so you could perhaps create your own database in SQL, or for REST you can use like a public thing such as Twitter is quite a good example that people go and try out with. There's a lot of documentation and examples on those things. Just get familiar with them. Some suggestions for development tools. So PowerShell has quite a few different editors. I tend to use the inbuilt ISE, Sublime Text for working with JavaScript or JSON files or just generic text files. SOAP UI for, as Sam mentioned, we used that tool to get information out of some of the systems on his project. And these are traditionally tools that an infrastructure person is perhaps not comfortable with. But they're not that scary. Get into start using them. Postman is one I use all the time for working with REST systems. So it's quite a friendly GUI tool that you can execute some REST queries against the system and get some friendly information back. And I'll typically do that before heading into VRO development. I'll run a few queries first and see how the system actually works. I added Spotify as a development tool with a pair of headphones. It's quite a good way to stop yourself being interrupted from other people.
You just need the headphones. Don't need to listen to anything.
Yeah, or pretend you're listening to something and you can ignore them. Okay, planning. Very important, Michael.
So we wanted to use up, I suppose, most of the rest of the time talking about planning an automation project, whether it be something in VRA, something with a standalone VRO, PowerShell related. There are, I suppose, some general concepts that are we've kind of focused in on based on our collected experiences, really. So kind of feel free to chip in at any point. So you took the red pill, and you're going to be working on some sort of automation project. Probably one of the most important things that you can get right or get wrong are your requirements. Just like any infrastructure project, any automation project is only as good as requirements. If you had dodgy requirements, your project can go south very quickly, and you'll never get back from it. So, it may seem obvious, but getting specific, unambiguous, and comprehensive requirements, as mentioned in some of the other war stories. So, just getting requirements from the customer that cover the tip of the iceberg exposes you to the fact that actually they wanted you to do all this other stuff they just haven't told you about. So, a process of workshops, discussions, documentation, just trying to set out exactly what the scope of the project is in a way that you can present back to your customer, whether that be internal or an external customer, and get them to agree that that's what you're working to. It's quite an important thing.
Yeah, I'd double that, replaying it back to people, making sure your understanding is the same as their understanding, because it's not always.
No. Looking at a conceptual design, so I said earlier I'd come back to the whole create logical network thing. This was the original conceptual design for that service. It was very high level, that it would be a service offered through the VCAC portal, adding a logical network, creating a virtual wire, adding a DLR interface, integrating with IPAM, updating the data dictionary, and spitting out an email at the end. Those were the basic steps. And again, in terms of making sure that your customer or your project stakeholders understand what it is that's going to be provided and that you're touching all the various points that you need to, then something like this is actually quite useful to kind of play back to them. Going a little bit deeper into the process flow, don't even try to read it, mapping it out in a little bit more detail, particularly if you're just the person who's actually defining the service, if you're not the person who's going to be doing some of the actual automation coding, then mapping this sort of thing out actually helps explain the steps that require the order you kind of think they need to go into to whoever's going to be doing it. So increasingly, a lot of organisations will try and farm out some of the development, especially if they don't have the skills in-house. But they might work on some of the process design and specification. So having something like this, where you can actually pass that across to somebody as, I suppose a guide for them to code against, as well as the requirements, is quite handy. The next thing you probably need to consider is the methodology you're going to take to produce your automation. Are you going to adopt a waterfall project approach? Are you going to have a more agile approach? This was something you brought up when we were talking about it. And I've seen kind of bits of both mingled in the same project, and it's kind of, it can be a little bit difficult working with two at the same time. You kind of need to work out which one you're plumping for. Right?
Yeah, they don't play well together. So if you've got a project manager who is rigidly in his waterfall and has to have everything rigid, for example, one of my project managers was like that, and my development, I mentioned 123 workflows. Now, the 4 workflows that they were looking for as outcomes, they said, right, at the end of week 1, we want workflow 1. At the end of week 2, we want workflow 2, and so on. And what actually happens is week 1 through to the last day on week 4 is actually developing 123 supporting workflows, and you only see the final workflows right at the end. But getting a project manager who was like, I want my waterfall, I want to know my steps, to understand that was very difficult, and there was a lot of backwards and forwards and tension going on, and ended up having a big sort of crisis meeting and demonstration of what I'd done so far, because they really just couldn't get their heads around the fact that there was these 2 methodologies and they don't necessarily talk nicely to each other.
Something that will come up inevitably are changes. So changes to your original scope, whether they be sort of planned, unplanned. To be honest, they're pretty much inevitable on any sort of automation project. The one I've been working on for the, 11 months, we had about 70 formal change requests logged eventually by the time I finished on the project. Some of these were fairly straightforward, where they wanted some changes to the kind of the look and feel of some of the services we'd already created. Some of them were slightly more significant, where they wanted to make the VCAC portal publicly available out on the internet, which required a complete redeployment of all the infrastructure because of the IP address changes. So, changes are inevitable. They're going to come around. The important thing is to agree a process beforehand and to make sure everything's documented and discussed with all the interested parties. Now, the thing is, expect changes. Don't just deal with them when they come up. You've got to expect them because they will happen. When it comes to testing, basically the moment you start writing any sort of code or script, you're a coder, basically. Whether or not you come from an infrastructure background, whether or not you come from a development background, you're a coder as soon as you write any sort of script within the eyes of project managers, stakeholders, customers. They're just going to view you as a coder, effectively. So obviously the approach of doing your testing in production, that's probably just not going to fly, unfortunately. The best thing you can probably look to do is establish a number of environments, a development environment, test, production, have them relatively representative, certainly when it comes to testing, ideally when it comes to development as well, because a number of problems can easily crop up when you have differences. Certainly that's one of the problems we had on my recent project, was that over time the production environment with all the changes became slightly different to the development environment, and that did produce a few problems going through, nothing too significant. Interesting one, don't know if you noticed the diagram at the bottom. Does it look familiar to anyone at all? No? Maybe seen it already this morning? That cycle that Joe Bagley was talking about. Looks a bit like that. And essentially that's what you're that's what you're striving to achieve, is going around that loop as fast as possible, developing functionality, testing it, pushing it into production, and going around that loop as fast as possible. And that's got to be one of the goals, obviously, of doing it, hence the agile approach. And really, it's the development life cycle, it's not testing. Idempotence. It's an interesting word that
we didn't know what it was until you told us about it.
I thought you needed a pill for that.
No, it's a cream. Anyway, so idempotence. So it's actually a mathematical operation, but it does also apply to programming, something that you possibly need to consider when you're putting together basic tasks is, what happens if it gets run more than once? Does it matter? It's one of the things that needs to come out during conversations with your customer, your stakeholder. Does it actually matter? Do you need to do something about it? What does it practically mean? Well, just taking an example here, creating a new DV port group. It's just something I kind of thought up on the fly. So we run it one time. We were submit a request for a new DV port group, we create that port group, and we return that port group at the end. But what happens if we do it twice? I guess the thing to bear in mind is, do we want it to fail? Do we want it to return some sort of error that already exists? Or do we want it just to return the existing port group? Do we want to do any validation at the beginning? These are all kind of things that need to be borne in mind, really. The rub with it, well, it's not always implemented by default. You take any of the built-in orchestrator workflows, normally PowerShell commandlets, none of them tend to be, well, most of them tend not to be idempotent in any way. Should you separate it from the business logic? So should you create very narrow functions that perform a specific task and build your idempotence into there? Or should you stitch lots of different functions together by a piece of customized business logic? Obviously, making as few changes to your sort of base library functions as possible is going to result in maximum reuse of your code as well. If you actually build up I suppose you're going back to the create logical network. If you build all your business logic into the top layer, rather than making changes to library functions and where needed use custom functions, then that enables the maximum reuse of those functions, reduces your kind of development time and potentially the impact of any changes you might get. Or maybe you want it to fail, is the other option. So that brings us on to the elephant in the room of error handling. And as we've all encountered on all of our projects, it's quite often been viewed as a bit of an add-on. So that's nice, but now we'd like it to handle errors a lot better. It's actually a lot easier to do that from the outset, not as an afterthought.
Not at the end when you've got 1 week left of 7 months.
Yeah. It's not a good time to do it there. So best thing to do is to try and maintain control of all the errors as you're going along. There's various reasons for doing it. I mean, to provide some meaningful feedback to users, for example, troubleshooting information for operations and support, or even enabling you to take remedial action, but actually trapping those errors as you go along is very useful. It's also very sensible to validate inputs to tasks and functions, and also the responses you get back from automation. Know what you're expecting to go in, know what you're expecting to come out, and test for it where you can. Does save a lot of headaches. So a couple of approaches for error handling. Sorry if I'm speeding along here, but I think we're running out of time actually. 5 minutes. Here's I suppose, as an example, a very light example of an orchestrated script, and using just a very simple try-catch structure to catch errors that enables you to do things like maybe log it in a more meaningful way, or take a sort of custom action based on the nature of the error potentially. But just putting in this simple structure, which doesn't take a lot, around bits of scriptable task, can actually make your life a lot easier and make your customers, internal or external, a lot happier. Other approaches, again using VRO, on more modern versions involve a default error handler. So should there be a problem anywhere within the workflow, run a particular piece of code. Perhaps you want to raise a support ticket. Or, again, as mentioned earlier on, should we be doing that, or should we be self-healing? Should we be rolling back? Should that be what we do? So, as an example of that, create an object. Oh, whoops, it failed. Perform some sort of cleanup, as an error action. You've got to be thinking of these things as you go through. So, for every object that you create or update, you've also got to be thinking about the way to remove it or clean it up.
I think that's important when it comes to, we were talking about idempotence and actually distilling down workflows to their smallest possible reusable unit. What you actually also need to do is think about how you would bubble up your errors from perhaps a small unit, which you don't necessarily handle an error in a specific way, but you just return an error from it. You've actually got to think about how you pass that error back up to, say, a parent workflow, and maybe to a parent workflow of that, and do something meaningful with it. So if you start, as you said, if you start without thinking about error handling, and then you get to the end and you try and retrofit it, it's a whole world of pain. If you've built in your error handling from the start, it means that you get these smaller reusable components that then can bubble up these errors and you can do something meaningful. So it all links together, the idempotence, the being able to handle the errors and getting those requirements. It all links together to become a successful way of doing it, rather than perhaps retrofitting it, which is sort of a bit awkward and takes a long time.
Yeah. So where is that silver lining? I think from my perspective, when it just works, when your customer's able to take what you've done and say, great, we've just snagged a really, really big name customer onto our managed services platform because they like what they've seen, they like the way it works, and the customer's happy because generally it doesn't tend to fall over very often, and everything seems to work as designed, as required. For me, and I think you had the example where you managed to obviously get rid of a couple of very expensive contractors. That's got to be a silver lining for a customer.
Yeah, I think that wasn't a silver lining for them, was it?
Yeah, well, not everyone wins, do they?
No. One of the best things for me is when I'm working on this sort of stuff is you run a PowerShell script for if you manage to write a script, run it for the first time, it does what it's supposed to do and doesn't throw an error. It's like a Google whack. It's like you managed to do that the first time, or you see that green tick in Orchestrator, that means it's successfully completed and it did what you wanted it to do the first time. I find that very, very pleasing. That's my silver lining.
I would say that the job is actually way more interesting than what I used to do. So probably like some of you, I've been a long time system administrator. You might have picked up from the keynote that the days of that kind of role may be numbered, and it may be time to think about doing something else. This is possibly one of your options, amongst other things. We all enjoy it to a certain extent, especially when the projects are over. You're not being shouted at anymore. But
which projects have you been on?
You can come and help if you want.
That's all right, thanks. So I think with that, we've kind of reached the end of our material. I don't know if anyone's got any questions at all. We're around all day if you want to come and pick our brains about anything. As we mentioned earlier, obviously we've all got blogs and there's various levels of different content on there. I haven't blogged for a while. Feel free to hit us up, get in contact at all. And I think we're about a minute early.
Thanks everyone for coming and listening.